He stumbled out from the chamber into the stale evening air, looking back over his shoulder as a huge metal door firmly shut behind him. He took a moment to try and adjust his eyes. He felt as if he'd fallen from a very bright place into this blackness. Even the shadows around him were now being swallowed up by the darkness. A beautiful darkness. He started pushing his way through the undergrowth. Only the faintest of light shone through the leaves. His left arm was in severe pain and his heart was pounding in his chest. He felt a shortness of breath and a dizziness like he'd never felt before. He was so desperate to escape. The need was overwhelming, but from what? He stood, frozen to the spot in the undergrowth for a few moments. I don't know what I'm doing outside, he thought. He could hear water dripping behind him somewhere. A continuous hollow dripping sound impossible to ignore. He had bumped his head on the way out of wherever he'd just appeared from. He had no idea as to where that chamber led to, or from, or why he was so intent on escaping it. He looked over his shoulder at the chamber to try and spark some kind of memory. The door of the chamber was immense. It had to have been over 1 meter thick and was well concealed within the undergrowth, in an area he instantly recognized as the park. The park was a vast area, acres of the only remaining greenery left in the city, surrounded by heavy Victorian cast-iron railings. A huge arched red neon sign above the entrance simply read, "The Park." The park was once a place of peace and tranquility, where children would often play, but the laughter of children in this park had died a long time ago. This dark, menacing park suits the eerie gloom it holds inside. Years ago, it would have been surrounded by pleasant eating and drinking places. These had now become more ominous and sinister, a constant reminder of how easily the park itself turned on everyone. At zero bars, customers would drink heavily into the very early hours of the morning, and every night, someone would be picked out to have their lives ended beside the gates of the park. Mr. Smith, the barman, would happily serve drinks to those that would soon become the park's latest unwilling victims. A self-made sign that clumsily hung over one of the many bar stools reminded them all of how their evening may end. Here in this bar, you fade out. Some drank there in the hope that they would be picked out, whether it was a terminal disease, a nagging wife, or they simply felt that the park was eventually only going to take them anyway. Whatever their reasons were, for them their lives were already too much to bear, empty faces that can't quite ever die. One could eat at Zomzom's, but this wasn't wise. It hung high above the park itself, an old, heavily decaying building on 2 humongous pillars. In the centre, where a third pillar should have been, stood a large moulded pillar constructed of both human and animal bones. Amongst the children's broken toys were fragments of skulls, arm and leg bones that hung awkwardly from the pillar, unfinished, as if it was all built in one day. After eating at Zomzom's, you could sit outside on a vast veranda, taking in the panoramic view of the park below. From wherever you stood on that veranda, you could easily view the evil within the park, danger and death, unfolding right before you. You could even watch the humans below trying to run whilst the machines in the clearing played Kill by Numbers. It was not safe to be caught out here in the park at night, he thought. His throat was very dry, and he continued to force his way through the branches and thorny bushes till it opened up into a beautiful green space, surrounded by wild growing flowers. Along the perimeter of the open space, there was a small section of what appeared to have originally been part of a walled garden. It lay in ruin, like the rest of the park. He found the start of a very narrow rocky path. At least he was now finally stood on solid ground. Here, he finally had an opportunity to look himself over. His hands were slightly cut from the bushes and he was covered in mud, but other than that, everything looked and felt normal. He was, as he expected to find himself, still dressed in black. His left arm probably his only injury. Then he noticed something hanging, dangling round his neck. A metal tag. It swung freely as he moved. He was surprised he hadn't noticed it before. It looked very aged, and the tag was completely covered in mud. A tin-plated tag. He couldn't read it upside down, so first he had to remove it from around his neck. He gently rubbed the mud from the tin plate, and it simply read, "The Replican." He was very puzzled and confused. He desperately tried to remember something, anything, but nothing offered itself up to him. At this point, he could not even recall his own name, so the Replican made his way towards the exit of the park. He knew roughly the direction of where the exit was. At least not all of his memory was completely lost. In fact, the Replican knew this place very well. It was embedded in his memory as a place you do not want to get caught in late at night. The park was full of killing machines, crazies, and rape machines that hunted there at night. The crazies were vicious scavengers with wide eyes and bony fingers. They lived in the many holes they had dug in the ground beneath the park itself. Food would eventually come to them. The crazies hunted en masse in groups. They merely wanted scraps of food, or any of your remaining cash or credits. In the absence of food, the crazies looked to pick over the bones of any carcass or any animal that had been discarded in the park. Corpses left by the killing machines would be slowly dragged away into the undergrowth, never to be seen again. It was, however, the rape machines that haunted your worst nightmares. If you managed to somehow survive the attack from a rape machine, the dream police would be called out to reset your memories back to how they were before the rape machine had cornered you. You knew, however, deep down in your own mind, even after the dream police had reset your mind, that something incredibly dark had just happened to you. The replicant had so far managed to stay out of sight. He was for now using the darkness to his own advantage. Other than the odd crazy that scurried through the undergrowth around the perimeter, he felt confident that he would make it to the exit. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness around him, he could see something out of the corner of his eye. Beyond the ruins of the garden wall, squarely facing him, was a tall man, sat perfectly still on a rusting park bench. He looked somewhat surreal. He appeared to be just sat peacefully, with his hands on his knees. The replicant moved closer, but in the darkness, he was still at a distance that made it impossible for him to see any features of the man, who just calmly sat there. Does he realize what might happen to him? The replicant hurried on by him. He kept to the shadows as he walked, ducked and dived between the planting and the trees. Every now and again he thought he could hear the sound of children laughing from between the trees. He stayed as hidden as he possibly could all the way, till he saw the back of the glowing neon sign at the exit. Someone had hung their own sign there, over one of the railings, a sign that read, "No exit. No one can save you here." "Who the hell am I?" the replicant said out loud. Then, wishing he hadn't said this out loud, as all of a sudden he heard the whirring of a machine directly behind him, like a nightmare on wheels. He moved quickly and heard more scurries from groups of crazies, who, like the machines, had now detected a presence in the park. He was now running on adrenaline, sprinting towards the exit of the park, his feet punching away constantly into the darkness ahead, searching for some way out. His feet slipped outwards as he rounded the corner at the exit of the park. His left arm caught a jagged corner of the metal railings, making him wince with pain again. He felt a numbness all the way up his left arm. His desire to reach the gates of the park and to escape in one piece had thankfully paid off. He was now stood outside the park. He knew that the killing machines did not venture out here. Catching his breath for a moment, he looked around all the Victorian apartments that bordered the park. All very tall, grand-looking buildings. They weaved their way like a snake towards the city. These buildings now stood as a constant reminder of the old world. He looked up and down the street. He inexplicably knew roughly where he had to cross the street, moved by habit, he thought. As the replicant crossed the street, a figure came out of an alleyway close by. He was a very tall figure in a sleek, almost black, velvet suit. The replicant noticed that the suit had bright red lapels, running from his neckline to his chest. This gave him the appearance of a figure of authority. As the replicant studied him more closely, he saw a number 7 badge on his collar. A downstat, he recalled. How he knew this was beyond him. He was recognizing places, other people and things around him, but very little about himself. As he crossed the street, he stopped short of where the downstat was now knocking firmly on a ground-floor apartment door. A tired-looking old man answered the door, pulling back several security bolts before opening the heavy door. The door, however, still remained on a solid locking security chain. The old man peeked through the gap in the doorway. Very few people answered doors, especially around the perimeter of the park. Most cowered behind locked doors, fearing the worst may be on the other side. The downstat leaned towards the opening of the door. "A random poll check. Do you ever think of women?" he asked. The replicant shook his head. Figures of authority like the downstat and the dream police were now everywhere. He walked on by as the old man became more irate with the continual questions he was being asked. He wasn't completely sure, but he thought his apartment was within eyeshot of the main entrance to the park. With this in mind, he walked further up the street until he was almost directly opposite the neon sign of the park. He looked over towards the neon sign, then shifted over slightly to his left, until he achieved the correct viewing angle he was looking for. The replicant then took several steps towards the sign, so that he was now stood in the middle of the road. Once he felt he had achieved the right perspective, he then turned around to look upwards to the top-floor apartment. "I live up there," he said confidently out loud. Remembering that he was ever so close to the entrance of the park, he swiftly turned, alerted by the noise of branches breaking underfoot. Stood behind the bars of the park, with both hands clamped around the cast-iron railings, was another dark figure. He recognized this figure as the man that had been sat so calmly on the bench. As the replicant tried to focus on his face, he realized he didn't have one. He was an unknown, a very tall figure, dressed completely in black. He appeared to have no facial features whatsoever. The unknown stood perfectly still. He appeared to be in a transfixed position, stood blankly, staring. Without a face, it was hard to tell if it was the replicant or something else he was staring at. A dog suddenly barked and ran by the replicant, making him jump. The dog whimpered, then darted down a nearby alleyway in fear, taking several litter bins over with him. When the replicant looked back over towards the railings of the park, the unknown was no longer stood there. He became increasingly edgy, and he could now hear the sounds of the machines whirring louder from deep within the centre of the park. He could hear the panic in those unlucky few that dared to cross the park at night, probably already pinned to the ground by the rape machine. Blood-curdling screams seemed to resonate from everywhere. Outside what he believed was his apartment block was a poster on the wall, a new poster because the ink was still sinking softly. There was a grey man walking away from the poster. The replicant assumed the grey man had just placed the poster there. From a distance, he looked almost humanoid, but a lot thinner and taller. The replicant had never seen a grey before. They were more like shadows than physical beings, simply drifting through our streets, amongst us. As he attempted to focus his eyes on the grey, he had already gone, disappearing in the alleyway. The dog was still howling in the distance. The replicant approached the poster that the grey had left. The poster showed a busy main street, with an old decaying church that sat in the foreground. It was somewhat familiar to the replicant, but he wasn't sure. Above the church, almost looking as if it had been superimposed onto the poster, was a weird structure. Below the poster, it simply read, "There is no God, so pray to me." He tried to get a closer look at the structure on the poster. Two young people stood waiting in the doorway, holding the door open for the replicant. He glared at them, looking for some sort of recognition, but he was fairly sure he had never seen them before. The couple exited the building. They started to cross the road, then they wisely opted to return to the safe side of the street. The couple were constantly laughing and chatting. "Who's the guy with the blonde hair and the black nails?" "I dunno," came a reply. "He ain't on my floor." The replicant looked around the lobby area. He saw row upon row of mailboxes. He recognized his mailbox. Room 8, top floor. He had snapped the key in the lock months ago, and there, protruding from the lock, was indeed half of the key which had rendered his mailbox useless. For him, memories felt as though they were only dripping into his heavy mind. "I also have a phone that never rings," he thought to himself, as he turned towards the staircase, pleased that he had finally remembered something. As he turned towards the staircase, from his point of view he could see the couple had crossed the road once more, and they were now back on the park side. It was very dangerous to walk on the park side at night. Anything could pull you in from beyond those railings. He could also see that in the fog and dust outside, that someone was following them. He was a very tall, well-built man, long coat, grey hat. He followed them, staying particularly close. The replicant had no doubt that this figure sticking to the shadows, trailing them, was a magman. The magmen were built to be inside the park with all the other machines, hearing noises and screams that no one should ever hear. However, magmen were incredibly intelligent machines, masters of intimidation, and were far better suited to be used in the outside world, away from the trappings of the park. Everyone feared them. Most felt safe in the city, with the luminous white lighting panels. But as power sources diminished, more and more of our lighting simply faded away. Most felt safe in their apartments, hearing the chants of death, death, death in the depths of the park. The endless screams from the park, knowing that at least it wasn't them that evening, and tomorrow was only a few hours away. Everyone felt safe so long as they didn't enter the park, particularly at night. The magmen that patrolled the perimeter were now stalking people who passed by, practically herding them in towards the entrance of the park. The magmen got an intense pleasure from watching the machines in the park tear humans apart. Animals were also no longer safe. Anything that was loose and not on a leash was vulnerable. The machines would rip birds, cats, and dogs to pieces, all part of their insane programming. Dogs, he thought. So few of them left. He wondered how many years that dog he had just seen in the alleyway had been running for. The replicant started walking up the stairs. He could feel something moving over to his left in silence. He could see in the shadows inside one of the doorways that it was a UD, an undesirable, a retired perverted officer from the Dream Police. He stood, leaning by the wall. The replicant could feel his mind decaying only inches away from him. He could feel him merging with his thoughts, ones he wouldn't dare to dream. Dream police had the ability of mind manipulation. Their version of a police force was nothing short of a joke. The dream police no longer kept law and order. Instead, they merely changed our perception of what had just happened. Parents of the many children that were lost in the park were always guaranteed a visit from the dream police. It was always a comforting visit for the grieving parents. After their visit, all memories of their children were simply wiped clean. That way your child was never ripped apart by the machines. You were just simply brainwashed by the dream police into believing you never had a child in the first place. They even went to the lengths of destroying toys, photographs, bedding, and in some cases whole rooms just to keep the dream police slogan alive. And the dream police's slogan, "What is on your mind?" was everywhere, and everyone apparently relied on the memory cleansing they provided. The replicant considered for a moment that perhaps this was the reason why he was unable to remember anything. Is that what it was? Had the dream police paid him a visit last night? He discarded that idea. The replicant had emerged from a strange chamber. The dream police only ever manipulated on minds when they're in the comfort of their own surroundings. That's the only way they could ever change your thoughts, when you were totally at ease. The replicant thought back to the chamber door, and it came to him suddenly. He remembered clearly now that he had been laid on some sort of hospital bed. He recalled the white linen sheets. That's when I turned and ran, he thought. He could now see clearly in his memory that he had pulled some sort of lever on the way out. This had then released the chamber door from the inside. Memories of where he had been seemed to pour over him like sun through blinds. He realized then that he hadn't been running from anything at all. He was just simply disorientated when he left the chamber. The replicant nervously sang a song from the old days in his head as he gingerly stepped by the undesirable. He sang a chorus of On Broadway in his head, just to prevent his perverted thoughts from poisoning his own mind. The UD slowly retreated to his darkened room, taking with him whatever perverted thoughts he managed to seize from the replicant's mind. The replicant finally reached the top floor and headed for room 8. He felt around his pockets for a key, but he had nothing in his pockets now apart from the tin plate name tag. As he approached his door, he realized that he didn't need his key. There was already a hole in his front door, just to the left of where his opening latch was. It looked like someone had put a battering ram through his door, punching a hole big enough to squeeze a hand through. The replicant saw that the door was already slightly open, and cautiously pushed it open further. The room was a large, wide-open space. A candle-lit shadow on the wall by the bed, and paint was peeling off his walls. It was a simple room. One solitary light bulb hung from the ceiling above him, and he had no curtains. He had a perfect view of the park, framed by his window. He instantly recognized the whole room was definitely his. Although smaller scattered things around the room now puzzled him, someone else had been here in his room. I'd been robbed, no doubt, he chuckled, of my memories, and now of my belongings. The replicant saw that the drawers had been emptied. Someone had knocked over an old lamp by his bed, clearly looking for something. He closed his door, adjusted the old lamp by his bedside, and tried so desperately hard to recall where he kept all of his valuables. And then it came to him in an instant. Under the floorboards, he said, moving around, circling his finger in the air till his distant memory found the spot. He pointed down at a definitive spot. He crouched down, shifted a small rug to one side, and then removed the semi-loose floorboard. There, laid under the floorboards, was a tin. He lifted the tin out and removed the lid. Inside the tin he had cash, credits, some rare metals, and a bunch of photographs. The replicant studied the photos and began to have yet another panic attack. It was similar to the panic attack he had when he left the chamber, but much, much worse. He laid out on the bed a great number of photographs. He studied them, panicking. He didn't recognize any of the people in them. There was a photo of himself in some sort of underground tunnel. It was a dark, eerie photograph, black eyeliner and spiky blonde hair. The edges of the photo were heavily weathered. It reminded him that this had been taken a long time ago, before the machines and greys came. The replicant sat staring at the photograph for what seemed like a lifetime, but they offered up nothing to him. He heard more intense screams coming from the park. Machines had pleasure in toying with us. No doubt someone had got far too close to the gates before they met their bitter end. That's when the replicant caught sight of him. As he was looking out across at the glowing neon sign, he noticed a figure off to the right, just across the road. There stood on the sidewalk, amongst the clearing of dust and fog, was a man in a long coat, grey hat, smoking a cigarette. Ahead of the magman, The sharp shadow of a lamppost had faded into the darkness of the street he stood on. It was a magman, the same one that followed the couple earlier, he thought. He could feel the hairs on the back of his neck rise when he realized that the magman was stood staring directly up at the Replican. The Replican retreated out of the light, so he could no longer be seen by him. He backed up towards his bed near the window. "What or whom is he here for?" he said, now feeling safely hidden from his view. A few uneasy minutes went by, and the Replican edged up carefully towards the window to see if the magman was still outside on the street. The magman was nowhere to be seen. He had gone. Into the park, perhaps? He looked up and down the street from his window. He saw scattered newspapers, street lamps, and yet he had no idea where the magman had gone. The park fell silent for a while, and, from where he stood, the view and peaceful silence he felt made him feel almost normal again. In another time this park would have been so beautiful, it would have been so pleasurable to relax there. He could, in that moment, briefly forget the nightmares that were waiting outside. But then, out of the silence, there was a knock at the door.